Hello and welcome to today's Bett Academy session with a special safeguarding focus on the issue of peer-on-peer abuse. As always, we want the session to be as practical as possible, so please do post any questions that you have in the chat box, and our speaker will be sure to answer as many of these as possible after their main presentation. We'll be recording the session today, so you'll be free to review and share with your colleagues afterwards, and there'll also be a handout uploaded to the on-demand recording that Emily, our speaker, will kindly provide. Just a reminder that this session is accredited and certified by Bett and CPD UK, and CPD certificates are available for download at the end of this session. So now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, founder and CEO of the Safeguarding Alliance, Emily Konstantas. So I'll pass over to you now, Emily.
Thank you, Emily. Well, I'm not going to forget that name, seeing as we share the name. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are around the world, to speak for you today at Bett. So today I'm going to be discussing peer-on-peer abuse, and obviously Emily so kindly introduced me, so I don't need to do that. I just wanted to start by introducing the Safeguarding Alliance for those of you that may not have heard of us or just currently not aware of us. We are an organisation. We have our head office based here in central London, where I am today, but we also do have offices around the world, making us quite a global organisation. We support schools, organisations with various topics, as you can see there, but I'm not going to waffle on any longer about that. I'm going to get straight into peer-on-peer. First of all, I wanted to start this session by really asking the question, and this is always a question that I ask the safeguarding leads sitting in front of me, and if we were having a face-to-face webinar, or it wouldn't be a webinar then, if we were having a face-to-face course, we'd be handing out a bag and actually seeing how much responsibility we carry. But as a safeguarding practitioner, it's really important that we take that a couple of minutes back and actually just answer that question: are we carrying too much responsibility, and are we actually able to continue to carry the safeguarding responsibility that we are doing already so? And actually that's very true for peer-on-peer. Peer-on-peer has become a very topical subject in light of the Everyone's Invited movement, but it's important that we're not just looking at that peer-on-peer in isolation, that we are actually not forgetting the other safeguarding responsibilities that we're carrying, and not losing sight of that very big picture of safeguarding. So safeguarding peer-on-peer abuse, I firstly wanted to start by saying it is nothing new, and I put the book of Tom Brown's School Days. I actually do quite like the book, but I'm sure some of you listening to this webinar will actually probably read it and remember the book. But actually, peer-on-peer abuse is nothing new. Although it's been heightened with the Everyone's Invited movement, it's not something new. It's not a new phenomenon. It's always been there, and unfortunately probably will always be there going forward. It's just really important that we identify in context, and this is really when we look at contextually to our school setting, our organisational setting, how we can map what our peer-on-peer abuse trends and safeguarding issues are contextually in order to mitigate against any future risk. So what is peer-on-peer? And I'm saying, talking about peer-on-pear abuse, but actually we need to just take a couple of moments to also consider what peer-on-peer abuse is. So there's a lot of media at the moment around peer-on-peer sexual abuse, but that is one element of peer-on-peer abuse, and it's important that we don't have so much focus on sexual peer-on-peer abuse that we forget the other aspects. It can be physical abuse, it can be emotional abuse, and peer-on-peer abuse can take place between any age group. So it can be a younger child to an older child to a younger child, and equally it can be girl on girl, boy on boy, boy on girl, and girl on boy. So it's really important that we don't just focus on one sex, one gender, one age group when we are considering peer-on-peer abuse, and it can happen both inside your organisation and outside of your organisation. And we're going to touch on a little bit today during this webinar actually how we deal with situations such as peer-on-peer abuse crisis when things are taking place outside of your school or outside of your organisation, and actually where does that responsibility begin and end. So as part of the first part of this webinar, and actually looking at our reflection and our responsibilities that we carry, I'm going to play a little short clip, a montage of clips that we've put together with some music in the background. And I really think the lyrics in this song, which I'm sure you're probably all going to have heard before, are so poignant in actually what they're saying. So it's really here about listening to those lyrics, and then we're going to discuss those after.
I've got so much to say, if only you would listen. I've tried every which way, and still you never listen. Can't you see I'm hurting? I couldn't be more clear, but I promise one day I'll make you hear.
You know I try to explain, I'm not the kid you want me to be, and yet it's all in vain. You just don't wanna see the real me. You think you know what I'm all about, and yet you just keep shutting me out. I got so much to share, if only you would listen. You could prove that you care, if only you would listen. I'm not gonna beg you, you'll never see a tear, but I promise one day I'll make you hear. Yeah, you'll see one day I'm gonna make you hear me.
Gotta find a way, but you are gonna hear me.
Got so much to say, and I'm gonna make you hear me. Maybe then you'll listen. You gotta listen. You need to listen. You better listen. I've got so much inside. If only you would listen. Joy and anger and pride. If only you would listen. It's not much I'm asking, I only want your ear. Yeah, I promise one day I'll make you hear. It's not much I'm asking, I only want your ear.
So really, I think the words there are absolutely, they fit so well with peer-on-peer abuse, and actually they fit so well with so many other safeguarding situations and concerns. It's about listening and hearing that voice of the child, hearing the voice of the young person. And I think a big question that we have to ask ourselves as practitioners, are we really listening to what that young person is saying? And they may not be orally vocalizing that peer abuse is taking place. It may be other non-verbal communication that you will need to pick up on within your organization and really hear what that young person is telling you. And that's absolutely paramount when we look at peer-on-peer abuse. And I'm going to put some case studies in here as well. I'm sure many of you will be aware of the Santana High School shooting that took place, where a 15-year-old boy, pictured here, actually shot 2 people dead and 15 other young people were injured. This young person was subject to a long-term peer-on-peer abuse. And nobody really picked up on it. And actually, his father was completely unaware of the abuse until this situation unfolded. And what I really, and the reason I've put these cases in and I'm discussing them, because it's really important that we don't lose sight of actually the knock-on effect and the bigger picture peer-on-peer abuse can actually have and actually take place. Another case here, in relation to peer-on-peer abuse, were 2 12-year-old girls who essentially took another child into the woods and stabbed this child 19 times, really leaving her for dead. And actually, luckily, this child managed to crawl out of the woods and get help. This little girl, and this is the little girl actually pictured here in yellow, she was subject to peer-on-peer abuse for a very, very long time, and she stayed and remained in that friend group because she so really wanted to fit in, and actually it wasn't picked up. So peer-on-peer abuse, it's not just sexual abuse, it's physical abuse, it's emotional abuse, there are so many different categories, and it's really important that as practitioners we are picking up on those signs, and actually we are creating those really safe spaces that young people feel safe enough to come and actually disclose that they are facing peer-on-peer abuse, but actually also that their peers may be facing peer-on-peer abuse. So it's really important that we have those safe spaces in schools or other organisations, but equally we are listening to what these young people are telling us, and actually really seeing and hearing what's going on. It's important when we're considering peer-on-peer abuse, we're actually also taking into consideration why a young person or a child may actually not want to disclose. What are those barriers to disclosing? Is it that the child is completely invisible? Has nobody actually noticed that there's peer-on-peer abuse taking place? Do they have divided loyalties? Where actually, if we looked at that previous slide that I just showed you, actually, is it that although there is peer-on-peer abuse situation taking place, that they're normalising the situation, that actually I'd rather be involved in this peer-on-peer abuse and not have any friends at all? Is it that the organisation doesn't have that opportunity for that young person to effectively disclose? Or are they protecting the individual or the organisation itself? They may actually also feel responsible. So it's really important that actually when we're looking at peer-on-peer, we're looking at that wider remit of safeguarding, because peer-on-peer abuse is one aspect, it's one element, and it's really important that we do not lose sight of other things that may be attaching themselves to a peer-on-peer abuse situation. It could also be that the young person who is effectively conducting the peer-on-peer abuse may also be subject to a safeguarding concern. So it's really important that we identify what those barriers are really to disclosure. Something that I would really recommend for organisations at the moment, in light of what's going on with the media, but not just about the media, just generally about implementing that best-in-class practice, is really reviewing your safeguarding and child protection policies. And actually, we would really recommend having a separate peer-on-peer abuse policy that really highlights what peer-on-peer abuse is, and actually what contextually that may mean within your organisation. Because what is taking place in one area may be very, very different to another organisation or another geographical setting. So it's important that as part of that policy review, we're also reviewing contextually what are our safeguarding trends in relation to peer-on-peer abuse. Is it that we have a higher heightened increase of sexual abuse? Is it that we have a heightened increase of physical abuse? But it's really important that as safeguarding practitioners, we are not just having this assumption just because this is the trend, that this is also the trend within our organisation. We need to apply that contextual practice. And as I said here, having that reviewing your peer-on-peer abuse policy and making it very clear who within your organisation will take the responsibility, but equally how a young person can seek support if they need to do so. And this is all about mitigating that crisis situation. So for those of you that don't know, the Safeguarding Alliance, we do a lot of safeguarding audits for organisations, and we do a lot of quite high intense safeguarding crisis management, and sometimes this does come out of a peer-on-peer abuse situation, and it's really through lack of process, policies, procedures, and that clarity around what peer-on-peer abuse really is. So it's really important that we're starting to mitigate a crisis situation before effectively it unfolds, and that actually we are proactively monitoring what our safeguarding concerns are in relation to peer-on-peer abuse, as opposed to just reacting to what's going on in the media. So of course, we have to have these reviews into sexual abuse, etc. But actually, as an organisation, are you proactively monitoring what your peer-on-peer abuse trends are in order to not just react, but to really put in place those preventative measures, really? So if we look at drafting that peer-on-peer abuse policy, it's really important that actually we're undertaking a full consultation with all of our key stakeholders. So who are your key stakeholders in your organisation? It could be your pupils, your parents, your carers, your governor's trustee board, but it's really important that we're not just drafting a policy that's just going to come off the shelf and we're going to ratify it at a governing body and there we go, it goes on the policy, back to the policy drawer. What's really important here is actually that peer-on-peer abuse policy remains contextual to your organisation. Something that the Safeguarding Alliance would really advocate is having a safeguarding ambassador, young person within your organisation. So of course we have safeguarding leads, but it's also really important that we're listening to that voice of the child. So going back to the words I used in that video, you know, I've got so much to say, are you listening? Well, how can you listen if you don't actively have that voice of the young person within those policies? So having a safeguarding ambassador who can really feed in, you know, we've seen an increase of this situation taking place. So to give you an example, and I spoke to Bett previously about this, is from a Safeguarding Alliance's perspective, we've seen an increase of young people being drawn into suicide rings via Discord, the app Discord. And actually this was flagged through safeguarding ambassadors who flagged it up and actually reported that this was taking place to the safeguarding lead within the organisation. So having that mechanism where you have that young person's voice is so important in order to mitigate and actually proactively safeguard your young person, your organisation and your own reputation as well. And it's really important that, again, as I said, we don't just have a document, a policy that sits on the shelf. It has to be a living document. So how, as a school, how as an organisation will you review that? So something that the Safeguarding Alliance do, we will do things called Safeguarding 5 a day, which are really short, sharp, five questions around safeguarding based on contextual policies. So, for example, who would you report to? What are your reporting mechanisms? And ensuring that it's not just your senior leadership team, your SLT team that know how to report, but also your ancillary staff, your security, your site security, your caretakers, your cleaning team, because safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And it's really important that everybody knows how to report and really knows what safeguarding is. So it's about not just having that policy, but testing that policy. So I've put here obviously some points to consider when we're looking at that safeguarding policy. First of all, of course, having the voice of the child. And I mentioned obviously having that young safeguarding ambassador voice, which is absolutely key. But also having parental and carer input. Do your parents and carers have any specific concerns that it's important that you are aware of? Is there outside of school substance abuse, for example? So we've seen a lot of peer-on-peer abuse situations being fueled by other safeguarding concerns. So, for example, substance abuse or online bullying. So it's really important that we have that wider community input. And that actually, as an organisation, you are really aware within that policy of those contextual risks. And if you are putting things in place like a safeguarding risk register, it's really important that's communicated to your wider school community as well. And actually within that, within the policy itself, ensuring that you have the reporting, referring mechanism, and that you're stipulating if you do have a safe place where it is. We went into a school recently and they had the most amazing facilities as a safe place for young people to come and sit down and just relax. And there was a safeguarding lead there if they needed to disclose. It was a brand new centre. When we actually were auditing the organisation, we asked the young people about this new safe space. They were completely and utterly unaware. So it's really important that if we are putting in place those safe spaces, the policies, that it's not just a practitioner level that have a wide understanding, but also our young people and our pupils have an understanding as well. So these are just a few points that I've put down for the policy, and I'm giving you a whirlwind tour of peer-on-peer abuse. So I do apologise that if we're not covering everything as in depth as we could. So what I really also wanted to move on really from that policy is actually crisis managing a peer-on-peer abuse situation. So to proactively mitigate against peer-on-peer, we have to know what our safeguarding trends are, and that's really going back to having those policies, those procedures, those communications that I really previously spoke about. But also we need to be ready and prepared as an organisation to deal with a crisis peer-on-peer abuse situation that may unfold, and actually have a real robust crisis management strategy that we will actually be able to support and actually safeguard ourselves moving forward. And actually, safeguarding crisis management is really important, that we don't just react to a safeguarding situation, that we proactively put in place that safeguarding crisis management so they're ready to deal with the situation. We would really advocate, if you can, actually putting in place safeguarding prompt cards and actually having things like a decision log already in place, and actually ensuring that you're evidencing, because when we discuss safeguarding, of course, absolutely the safety of that young person, the safety of that child is paramount. But we mustn't lose sight of actually we also need to safeguard ourselves as practitioners and safeguard the reputation of our organisation as well. So forming part of that evidence trail and those decision logs is really, really important, because what it really does, it allows you to effectively safeguard yourself and evidence why you've made the decision that you've made, and actually moving forward, if it ever did go to a court of law, you can present that forward and actually say these are the decisions that we effectively put in place. It's important that we have a structured crisis management team ready to deal with peer-on-peer abuse, and we don't just wait for a crisis to unfold. Organisations should already be mapping out who will form part of this safeguarding crisis management team. Is it going to be your DSL, your safeguarding lead, your head teacher? Do you have appropriate legal representation? I'm aware that we may have some international organisations with us here today. It's about ensuring that we're forming relationships and partnerships with external bodies as well that we may need to bring in to support us. You may have a specific HR specialist or a health professional, but it's really important that actually we're mapping out in preparation and hoping that it never happens, but in preparation for a peer-on-peer abuse situation, who we will call in order to mitigate reputational damage, as well as obviously safeguarding the child and the young person as well. So some of the things that I would put in place for that crisis management checklist would be a really robust communication strategy. Again, ensuring that we are aware of legal requirements and regulatory requirements, that's both nationally and internationally, and also ensuring, going back to that policy, was our policy fit for purpose? Was it up to date? Are we aware within the policy what we would do if we do have a mass peer-on-peer sexual abuse disclosure take place? Do we know how we would handle that? Do we have our pre-prepared media statements? But also from a monetary perspective, a financial aspect, we've worked with many organisations who have almost been to the point of bankruptcy due to the litigation that historical child abuse and peer-on-peer sexual abuse claims have actually brought forward. So it's really important that we're considering the widest possible remit of safeguarding when we are actually taking into consideration that peer-on-peer abuse. And naturally, that brings me on to my little umbrella. It's really important that actually we are considering the umbrella of safeguarding when we're looking at peer-on-peer abuse, because it crosses over into an online safety, obviously a physical in school sense, but actually having that robust policy of actually stipulating what the school or the organisation itself, and I appreciate we may not just have schools here today, what you are going to be responsible, what you're going to be responsible for, and where your responsibility lies as an organisation, both inside and outside of school. And actually, when we're looking at peer-on-peer abuse awareness, not just having becoming so peer-on-peer abuse centric focused that we lose sight of actually other safeguarding trends that actually may be fueling that peer-on-peer abuse situation taking place. So when we're looking at safeguarding, it's about looking at the widest possible umbrella of safeguarding and actually how we protect ourselves as an organisation as well. So when we look at safeguarding and crisis managing a peer-on-peer abuse situation, I always break it down into the following stages. And actually, when we work with organisations, it's really important that we have a very clear strategy, a methodology in terms of really getting to the core of actually what's taken forward with that peer-on-peer abuse situation. So the first thing I would recommend it for organisations and schools here that may have concerns with regards to a peer-on-peer abuse situation is actually conducting a root and branch audit of your organisation. This is something that the Safeguarding Alliance would come in and do, and obviously we're just telling you what we would do so you could do it internally here, but really conducting that root and branch audit to get to the bottom of actually do we have those robust policies? Are staff, pupils, parents, governors, trustees, is everybody aware of actually what peer-on-peer abuse means? And actually in context, what our potential safeguarding trends are within the organisation? And actually, if we then do have an incident, how are we going to manage that incident? So who are our crisis management team? What does our policy say? What are our next steps going to be? And it's really important when we're looking at peer-on-peer abuse that we manage and we contain the situation. We've worked with so many schools around the world, and actually, unfortunately, and I'm sure many of my listeners here today will probably be able to relate to this, but parent-carer WhatsApp groups seem to spread like wildfire. And actually, before the school or the organisation has managed to even release a public statement, everybody's found out about it. So if there is a peer-on-peer abuse situation that is about to go to press, it's really important that the organisation itself is managing the incident, managing the PR around what has taken fold. And that's really important. Actually, conducting that root and branch audit will allow you to really clarify and obtain what's happened and actually be able to speak with clarity when you're talking to the press. What's really important, obviously, we're conducting the root and branch, we're then managing the incident. We also need to showcase that we can embed a culture of safeguarding excellence within and across the organisation. And it's about collating that evidence. Because as I mentioned previously, it's really important that you have an evidence folder of safeguarding compliance, especially when potentially a peer-on-peer abuse situation could escalate either to the press, either to a court, or anywhere else to your regulators. So it's really important that if that does actually take place, that you have that evidence folder. So the Safeguarding Alliance, obviously we have our own evidence folders, but as an organisation, having your own checklist that you can go back to and actually say, well, we conducted this audit, these are our results, this is the peer-on-peer abuse situation, we know these are our safeguarding trends, and really understanding your contextual school makeup in terms of what is actually happening within your school, because it's not just about having a telephone call, and I had a phone call with a social worker or a police. How are you going to evidence that? Because if you don't have evidence of what you've done, unfortunately, it didn't happen. And this isn't just about what happens now. When we look at peer-on-peer abuse, a young person, if they've gone through a peer-on-peer sexual abuse, for example, they may not disclose for a number of years. But actually, when they do disclose and those historical peer-on-peer abuse, sexual abuse cases come back to the organisation, it's important that you can evidence what happened during your time when you were in charge and you were that practitioner. So having those evidence and those robust portfolios are really important for your own personal safeguarding as well as evidence for that young person. And actually, when we're looking at peer-on-peer abuse, a really important element here is safeguarding case management, because that is really your evidence as to what's happened and how effectively you've dealt with that situation in hand. And I know organisations will vary. We've worked with some organisations who will have online case management systems, top of the range, and we've worked with organisations who will have the top of the range paper-based reporting and case management systems. It doesn't matter which case management system that you have. The most important element that you can have within your case management is that you are ensuring that, one, everybody within your organisation knows how to use it, knows where and how to access and report, but also you're not missing pieces of that safeguarding puzzle that are really there to protect yourself and your organisation. And actually, safeguarding case management is really important, because if we have a challenge or a concern, it's important that we're raising this. It could be a young person exploring limits. It could be a reaction to an event, but that challenge could then lead to a risky behaviour. And that risky behaviour within itself could have a serious consequence, such as self-harm, suicidal ideation, which ultimately, again, is a safeguarding concern. So we're constantly doing that circle of safeguarding case management, and it doesn't stop. So it's really important with regards to peer-on-peer abuse that we are actively managing cases and we're evidencing as we go forward. So some of the things to consider when we're looking at peer-on-peer abuse crisis management is actually, who are your team? Do you have that robust case management? Again, going back to those policies, those procedures, are they absolutely up to date? If we're looking actually at your multi-agency stakeholder engagement, and again, I'm noticing a lot of international hello from everybody internationally. So if we're looking at our international stakeholders, are we aware geographically to our location who our stakeholders are? If we're putting in place risk assessments, are we actually communicating risk assessments? We've seen really robust risk assessments within an organisation, but actually they weren't communicated, which actually culminated in a peer-on-peer sexual abuse situation with a primary age children, because the risk assessment and the mitigating factors to really mitigate against that risk were not communicated with the wider school community. So it's really important, if you have risk assessments, again, they are robust and they are communicated. And again, does your organisation have an allegations action plan? Would you know what to do if an allegation of peer-on-peer abuse came in? Would you know who to contact, how to record that evidence? And actually, if you have a case of historical peer-on-peer abuse situation coming in, do you have a designated individual within your organisation who will actually be able to deal with that historical concerns? And again, really having those mapping exercises with regards to safeguarding and peer-on-peer abuse. So knowing who your young people are, listening to what they're saying, going back to that video. Are you listening? They have so much to say. Are we really listening? And actually, as practitioners, we have to constantly ask ourselves that. We can't just have an assumption just because there's this situation taking place in this school is also applicable to our school or our organisation. And also insurances, ensuring that your insurances are up to date as well. So something that I would really stress here as well is really not operating alone as a safeguarding practitioner. So they're obviously some of the key points to consider when we're looking at safeguarding crisis management with regards to a peer-on-peer abuse situation. And it's really important we take our time to get the first communication right, so we have that clear message of how we are dealing with a peer-on-peer abuse situation within our own organisation. Because ultimately, why do we safeguard? We want to mitigate against peer-on-peer abuse because we want to safeguard the child or the young person. Ultimately, no practitioner listening to this webinar wants to ever have to deal with a child death. And that is really the ultimate what we are mitigating against. But also with regards to peer-on-peer abuse, we want to stop that impact trauma. We want to stop adverse childhood experiences, and that's something that the Safeguarding Alliance as a research organisation we're looking into at the moment, that real adverse childhood experience that can also be really take place with peer-on-peer abuse, and also post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are all things that the reason we are safeguarding and the reason we are raising the awareness of peer-on-peer abuse, because ultimately we are there to safeguard that child and young person. So right at the beginning of this webinar, and I appreciate I've given you a whirlwind tour, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions as well. Right at the beginning of this webinar, obviously, I asked the question, how much responsibility do you carry? And actually, it's really important that you do, from a professional resilience perspective, take that time to have some reflection as to actually look at where you are, and actually, if you are carrying too much responsibility and you're breaking your back, like this poor gentleman here, it's time that actually we share that load of responsibility with our colleagues, with our peers, and actually look at, where we might potentially need some support ourselves. So I'm going to take some questions now, and I'm trying to keep within my time limit, Bett, don't worry. I've put our contact details down as well, our social media. We're not terrible on social media, but I've put down a little bit about the Safeguarding Alliance and our email address. So if you do have any specific questions that I don't get to answer during this webinar, please do feel free to email our info, and I'm sure one of our team will be able to respond as well. So I'm ready to take the questions. I'll let Emily come in with the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your expertise on this very topical issue of peer-on-peer abuse, and how it should be viewed and addressed as part of a more joined-up approach to safeguarding. So yeah, in terms of questions, I believe our first question comes from Jordan, who asks, at my workplace, the vast majority of our students speak English as a foreign language, and many struggle to explain their problems fluently. In the absence of having someone who can translate for them, what would you say is the best approach to getting them open up?
Absolutely. This is, I'm smiling away, in response to that, and working with many international schools, it's really, I would really highly advocate having translated safeguarding cards. So looking at who your students are within your organisation. And actually, if you have Arabic, Urdu, whatever language it is that you may be using, having translated safeguarding cards and actually having a voice of the child form that your young person can make a statement on in their own language. So let them express themselves in their own language, and then actually, if needs be, get an accredited an approved translator to translate it back. But it's really important they have the ability to express in their mother tongue, actually, to really explain what's going on.
Great, thanks, Emily. Next question we have is from Karen, who asks, any tips on how to get a young person to open up when you suspect peer-on-peer abuse is occurring? It's very difficult to manage if the young person says it's all okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that goes back to really knowing what's going on for your young person, listening, not just with what they're saying, but actually their body language. And I think just generally raising awareness of peer-on-peer abuse, be that through the curriculum, through your assemblies, through one-to-one tuitions, and having that safe space that actually your young people know where that safe space is, and actually constantly reiterating posters around the school. And I know it sounds silly, but actually posters on the back of toilets where they may be alone, and actually may take the time to read who to contact, how to contact, and just being there and creating that space for a young person to come forward and disclose.
Brilliant. And just to follow up with that, Emily, are there any specific phrases that maybe educators in school could use to help with this?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, what we don't want to do is obviously direct the young person. We want to really let that young person come and have a conversation. So it may be, what's going on for you? How are you feeling? Open-ended questions that actually, obviously, it has to be contextual and you have to gauge the situation in front of you. But open-ended questions that will allow that young person the opportunity, because sometimes that young person may not have the opportunity to make that disclosure. So it's about having that time as well to have a disclosure, because what you don't want to do is quickly in the passing of a corridor, nobody has time to actually have that, take that time to listen. So really taking your time to listen, I think, is really important.
Great, thanks, Emily. Next question from Natalie, who says, working with schools, I see some pushback to the idea of some staff types logging concerns without supervision. Do you experience this in your work, and how do you counter it?
So yes, I would say another issue that we encounter a lot when we conduct audits of schools is actually, especially when we're looking at the online platforms, not everybody will have access to the same level of login, for example. It's really important. Training is absolutely key. I'm a bit of a training geek. I don't believe in online tick box training at all. I really do think the training needs to be contextual to your organisation. Staff need to be trained to know how to complete a concerns form. They need to know what information needs to be included. Not it was a lovely sunny day and so was skipping into school. That's all very nice, but we need to understand really what's going on. So I think training is really, really key to embedding that culture of safeguarding. And actually, even without the supervision, it's just monitoring. And you may find that 5 members of staff have reported, but 1 member of staff hasn't. If you're actively monitoring your cases that are coming in, my question would be obviously to that 1 member of staff, not obviously condemning, but really looking at, is there a little bit of extra support that may be being required? So I think training is really key, and actually also ensuring that everybody within your organisation has the ability to actually report a concern, be that your cleaning team or the chair of governors. Everybody is just as important when it comes to safeguarding and making those reports of concerns.
Thank you. Our next question from Amy, who asks, any tips on how to help a student who is unable or unwilling to accept that they are in fact the abuser of their peers?
Yeah, absolutely. And we get this a lot. I think, again, it goes back to that wider awareness. So really through assemblies or through however you will do it within the curriculum, it's about constantly reminding, what peer-on-peer abuse is, because with so much that's taking place outside of school, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion and a blurred lines of responsibility when it's then brought back into school. So it's really important we're just reiterating the whole time what peer abuse is and actually how it will make people feel, and doing that in a very visual way. Young people I myself are a visual learner, that getting them involved, poster competition, or having that safeguarding ambassadors in the school. I can't advocate higher for that, because actually it's that voice of the young person, and they will pick up very quickly and be able to really support from a young person's perspective as to how to approach that. Sorry, Emily, I'm talking quickly because I know we're running for time and we've got questions.
No, not to worry at all. Yeah, we'll take a couple more questions, I think. So next question from Asa, who asks specifically, do you have any recommendations for schools applying for the CIS evaluation application?
I don't really have anything specific with regards to that. Obviously, safeguarding is absolutely key to safeguarding for us is the golden thread within any organisation. It's important that you are not just looking at safeguarding and child protection. I would say if you're applying for any accreditation, be that the Safeguarding Alliance, CIS, any regulatory body around the world, that you are actually considering that wider remit in safeguarding. So where does safeguarding sit in premises? Where does it sit in governance, etc.? So it's about that wider umbrella, I would say, with regards to that.
Great. And then I think the final question that we'll take for today before we wrap up is from Tom, who says, it's a lot to focus on. What would you recommend is the number one thing to focus on in the short term?
The number one element to focus on the short term, I think, is actually listening to that young person, listening and being aware of your culture of safeguarding. So not just relying that your school or your organisation are telling you that actually, we have robust safeguarding here. I'm not an expert in safeguarding. There are no experts in safeguarding. And if anybody tells you we are the safest organisation, it's a lie. Because just as you think you understand safeguarding, something else will crop up that you've never seen before. So I think it's being prepared for the unthinkable when you are looking at peer-on-peer abuse, and actually being ready to deal with those situations that you're not really prepared for. But you do that by listening and constantly reviewing your practice internally.
Brilliant. So great. I think we'll wrap it up there for now. But once again, thank you so much, Emily, for sharing all of your valuable expertise on such a topical subject. And thank you so much to our audience for attending and for sending all of your questions in. And sorry we couldn't get through to all of them today. Just to remind you that the CPD certificate for this session is now available to download in the handouts tab. And also to remind you that the session has been recorded, so you'll be able to review that. You should get an email through after this webinar finishes with the details of that, and you can review and share that with your colleagues. And also there will be a handout that Emily will kindly provide as part of that on-demand recording. So great. I think all that's left to say is I hope you have a great rest of your day, and hopefully you can join us for our next Bett Academy session. Thanks so much, Emily, again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.